Good afternoon and welcome. This is Deborah Linnell of the Van Buren Charitable Foundation, and I'll be moderating this second in a four-part series on executive transitions. This series is presented by the nonprofit quarterly, BoardSource, and Raffa PC, and we wish to thank the team of Tom Adams at Raffa, Renetta Walker at BoardSource, and Ruth McCambridge at MPQ for putting the design of the series together. Before we start, I want to let you know that you can ask questions at any time by using the Q&A function at the bottom right of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible by the end of the session. And let us know if you're having any technical difficulties, and our web folks will reach out to you. This session, of course, specifically addresses what CEOs need to think about in preparing for and accomplishing a transition that is as healthy as possible for them and their organizations. In my last position at Third Sector New England, I was privileged to help build its executive transitions program, and in doing so was deeply fortunate to have wide guidance from our two speakers today. They are both highly accomplished, and my introduction of them only highlights part of the important work they have done throughout their careers. Susan Egmont is the principal of Egmont Associates, a national full-service executive search firm for nonprofit organizations and foundations. Since 1999, Susan has assisted over 200 organizations in their leadership transitions. She's also a founder of the Alliance for Nonprofit Management and was the executive director of the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts Foundation. Susan holds an MBA from Emory University and is the co-author of Managing Leadership Transition in Nonprofits, Passing the Torch to Sustain Organizational Excellence. I also know Susan as a generous thought partner who shares her knowledge widely for the betterment of the nonprofit sector, as she has done with me many times. Karen Gaskins-Jones is the principal of JLH Associates. She provides individual and group coaching, organizational consulting, and has a long history of facilitating leadership transitions and succession planning. As a collaborating consultant partner with Transition Guides and Compass Point, Karen developed a specific training to help leaders wrestling with the same transition issues we will be talking about today. She has her master's from Texas Southern University and is the author of Leadership, Development, and Emergency Succession Planning, an organizational planning workbook. Finally, I know Karen from her consultation work with Third Sector's Executive Transition Program, where she helped to refine the program's approach to cultural competence. She's another great thought partner who cares deeply about the sustainability of healthy nonprofits and communities they serve. So our format consists of hearing from these two wonderful experts for the next 40 minutes, and then I'll be selecting and asking them questions that you've submitted during the webinar. And I also want to say, if you're interested in either of the two books I just mentioned or any other resources, you'll be receiving a reference list at the end of the seminar from the host. So Susan, let me begin with you. The majority of people don't suddenly wake up one day and decide that they're leaving their leadership position. For the most part, it's quite an inner journey. Could you talk a little bit about how you've seen leaders progress through their decision-making?
In organizational life, it's really important to remember that everyone comes and everyone goes.
Next slide.
And when you start to think about the fact that you will be leaving the organization, it can be a gradual process. It reminds me a little bit of when I decided to move from the suburbs into the city some years ago. It started one day on the road when I had been on the road too long getting into town, and I thought, this job is probably coming to an end for me. I'm going to need to make a change in where I live. So I started looking at the paper. Do you remember when the newspaper used to have classified ads? But thinking about another place to live. And then I put it away for a little while. And then I started to pick an open house here and there and try it on, think about another house. And then I put it away for a while. And finally, I found a house that I really liked and knew I would have to put my house up for sale. And when I finally put that for sale sign up in front of my house, my neighbors came running over saying, "Wait, what are you doing? You're leaving us. How can this be happening?" Well, they hadn't been part of my inner journey for the last months, thinking about selling that house, moving to another house in the city. It's that way quite a bit when you start to realize that you've done this budget 9 times or 15 times or 20 times, you can monitor yourself and see that the enthusiasm is lagging, that you just don't have the excitement about the job that you used to have. And when you start to think about moving on to something else, it's time to be very honest with yourself. Now, while you're thinking this through, it's not a good time to share with your board chair or with your staff that you're starting to feel the enthusiasm lag. It's a good time to talk to your friends, to your spouse, to have a coach or have a counselor, but don't announce that you're leaving until you're absolutely certain that you are.
So, Karen, can you elaborate and provide your perspective on how people know that they're getting ready to leave, and speak to some of those practical considerations they might be considering or should be?
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you, Deb. Susan's story was a great example of how our whole decision around are we ready to leave really starts with our private musings. And as we turn over to the next slide, what you might be feeling is like an emotional roller coaster, because usually at this stage of life, a lot of people are feeling as if they have too many competing demands for what's happening in their life. The work seems to be burdensome. Other life demands seem to be just pressing in, and nothing feels satisfactory at that point. So just as the next slide will show, we need you to really take time to get clear about what you want. Now, when we're feeling very burdensome with everything that's going on in our life, the question is, when was the last time you took a real vacation? I mean, really got away from everything and allowed yourself to just really enjoy being. Sometimes taking time out and letting everybody else run the show is a great opportunity for you to get additional perspective. Are you still engaged? Are you still motivated? Do you still want to be there? Or maybe it's a longer type of opportunity. You may still want to be engaged, but you need some time, a longer time out than just 1 or 2 weeks of vacation. Perhaps a sabbatical would be it, where you can do some research and get re-energized emotionally, mentally, and physically. And then some people kind of figure out, well, I really do want to do something different at this time in my life. And trying to figure out what that new thing really is going to be important. So being clear with yourself, particularly as Susan suggested, before you get ready to announce you're thinking about leaving is really important. Now, the bottom line is basically when you are beginning to believe it is time to leave, key question would be, are you still the right leader for this organization? And that takes a lot of honesty and self-awareness for you and others, all right? To really understand that you see yourself as a person who used to be a good fit, but may not be a good fit for the future. The other key question, as the next slide will show, would be, are you prepared to move on? So have you done your checkup about how portable are your skills? What other kinds of opportunities would you like to deal with? Or are you in that stage of life where you think retirement and then volunteering, doing something leisurely would be very good for you? Regardless of what your career goals might be, being financially and emotionally prepared to move on are critical components at this time. This is still part of your private musings. Right? Was that helpful, Deb?
Yes. So, Susan, once people have thought through privately to themselves that they're ready to move on, what in your mind happens next to experience a smoother transition as they go from private to public communications around this?
Well, first of all, check your timing. Many times people go and say that they're going to be leaving in the next 2 years, thinking that they're giving the organization plenty of time to get ready. And in reality, people can't process very well beyond about a 1-year period. There's a funny commercial on television right now where a woman goes into her boss and says, I'm giving you my 15-year notice. And some people really do that because they feel the organization needs time and they need time. But as Karen mentioned, doing that personal readiness privately to yourself and then letting people know you're ready to go is important. So start with the communications plan. And I suggest that a communications plan might go something like this. First of all, you would have coffee with your chair of your board and say, the time has come for me to go. You may lose control of the process at this point, at this very early point, so you should be prepared. But if your chair is like many and is surprised by the news or is concerned by the news, your chair can work with you then on the rest of the communications plan. At some point, the executive committee should come next so that the knowledge that you and the board chair are sharing about your departure becomes more operational within that important board committee. And then, of course, the full board will need to know. I would suggest that this happen around a 9-month point where people have a little bit of time to catch their breath, think about what this may mean for the organization. And here's a very important shift where instead of thinking about yourself, you do start thinking about what the organization needs to get ready. Perhaps the organization needs to do some more financial planning. Perhaps there is no strategic plan ready to go. Perhaps your senior team needs a little bit more time and a little bit more responsibility to be ready to take the organizational reins. But when you and the board have agreed upon an actual time frame for this to happen, then is the time to tell first your senior staff and then, of course, the broader staff. And the more people hear, the more people are brought into the circle, surely it's going to become public. So you need to be ready for a real public announcement inside and outside the organization. You may want to talk to funders before you go public. But at one point, you will find that people are generally aware and you start to get reactions. You start to get pushback. 2 times this week I've seen interesting reactions to the announcement that someone is leaving. One was the minister of my own church, and after 15 years, a letter came out in the mail saying that I'm going. Before at the end of the letter, after he told us what a wonderful opportunity he had, he said, I hope you will forgive me. Now, some people already are angry about his departure, and I've seen this with executive directors of organizations too. How could you leave us? I thought that you were deeply committed to this mission. You must not care about us as much as we thought you did if you're leaving. And some people will be in denial. Some people will try to hold your feet and say, no, you can't go. Another executive director this week who gave his notice so he could take a new position was immediately locked into a 4-hour meeting where the executive committee tried to change his mind. So once again, when the announcements are made, hold the line, be consistent, and model maturity for others who are learning the news for the first time.
Susan, we have a question from a listener that's apropos to what you're speaking about. Have you seen people become a lame duck or worse, been shown the door sooner than they were planning?
Yes, it can happen. In many instances, people will work through those feelings of surprise and anger or sadness about your leaving and realize that you have a lot that you can do to help in the transition time. You should not plan to be on the search committee, but you should assist the board in taking next steps that they will need to take. If there is discussion about an internal successor, you can provide some input into that conversation, knowing that person very well. But the board may say to you, thank you, we'll take it from here. And it's a sad situation, really, if that does happen, but one that you cannot really change. If they are ready to go on, you must shift the focus to yourself, getting ready personally. And there are many things that you can do. And I think we'll talk about that in just a few minutes.
Yeah. So, Karen, sometimes these transitions or announcements don't go so smoothly. Are there some common mistakes you've seen, pitfalls to avoid?
Oh, yes, indeed. Some of the pitfalls would be that the leader is consumed with fear, and as a result becomes pretty self-absorbed and loses perspective about how the impact of one's behavior affects staff, board, as well as key stakeholders. So having that kind of clarity about what kind of departure you would like to have for yourself is very important. Another piece would be not leaving the organization as well as you can. No matter how long you've been with the organization, whether you're a founder, a long-term executive, or you've been there for maybe 3 to 4 years, it's going to be important to really figure out what is doable before you can move forward and what must you leave for the next leader of the organization. So since this is such an emotionally difficult time, it is helpful sometimes for the executive director who is departing to really find a coach or a consultant who can help keep them grounded emotionally and mentally, and to forge, if you would, an opportunity to have a strategy that says, this is a legacy I really want to leave with the organization. This will move us forward. This is as far as I can take it, and I'm willing to pass the baton in a way that shows that I am a leader that cares about the future of this organization. Another thing would happen is that many leaders have chosen to protect the organization by taking a salary that's not commensurate with market value. And therefore, when they get ready to leave, maybe their benefits package is not sufficient to support them as they leave. Perhaps the retirement salary that they were expecting, if they were expecting any at all, would not be livable. So can they truly retire, or must they get another job? How are they going to support themselves even when they are searching for perhaps for that new opportunity? So sometimes that transition coach or consultant who's focused only on the departing executive can be very helpful in negotiating a great exit package and strategy for the departing executive, and therefore making sure that the relationships aren't burned and no bridges are destroyed in the process. The other piece would be what's needed to sustain the organization or program. In that particular case, this is where finding a transition consultant who's going to work with the board and the staff to manage the moving on part of this leadership transition is going to be important. An organizational assessment to really figure out what are your strengths, what are your areas of vulnerability. Can you truly attract the new leader at a market value that is appropriate for today's reality? And if not, who do you get as an interim executive to keep the organization stable and to build its capacity to attract someone with the right skills and experience to take the organization into its future? These are some of the things that even the departing executive needs to be able to understand, to work with, and be able to lead from where they are in order to stay relevant and understand what their role would be in this stage of their public declaration. So when you turn to the next slide, some of the challenges around what might happen in a scenario are outlined here. And depending upon how in the organizational assessment the organization is evaluated in its health and well-being and life cycle, there could be some serious leadership challenges for the new executive that's coming in. For instance, if the organization really is suffering from significant budget loss, a depletion of their funding sources, and the staff is demoralized, then there needs to be someone who's going to be able to go in and turn that organization around, rebuilding it, restoring the service delivery. If you have a founder or a long-term executive who's leaving, one of the key issues would be how does the shadow of that former leader interfere with the new leader really coming in and establishing his or her own leadership entity and be respected? Or is that shadow something that diminishes the next person? So the person who follows a charismatic founder becomes an unexpected interim executive. These are some of the things that you need to really think about as you are looking at how do you prepare the way as a departing executive to make sure that the transition can be effective and smooth. Is there anything you would like to add, Susan?
I would say to give yourself some emotional space during this time as well. Take a little bit of time away from the organization. Really take weekends, maybe for the first time in a very long time. I remember leaving an organization that I loved very much after 11 years with them. And I was excited about the new steps in my life and happy to move on to the next stage. But the first time my staff had a staff meeting without me and closed that door with me on the other side, it felt like a ton of bricks. I sat in the floor and cried like a baby. And it was very unexpected for me. So there may be times when you just have to excuse yourself and cry, and that's all right too. But keeping it so that those emotional moments are as much as possible on your own and not in a public setting, of course, is helpful to everybody. I had one departing executive director who said he was ready to go fishing. He had time to be with his grandkids and couldn't wait to go. But on the Monday morning after his successor arrived, he was in his office. He said he was cleaning out his paperwork because he hadn't done much of that before his successor came. But the second week, he was in his office, and the third week he was there too. And finally, the new executive director had to go to the board and say, it's me or him, he's got to go. So it was a very difficult departure because he didn't really have a plan. I think one of the best things you can do is to plan that vacation for the week after it's time to go. And I always advise departing executive directors to really step away for a period of 6 months. Give yourself time to release those emotions, to think about new things. Give your staff time to form new loyalties. Give your successor time to create relationships. And then perhaps there may be a role for you to play, or you may be ready to truly move on in your life.
Yeah, and if I could add, I worked on a study on sabbaticals, and one of the key findings of that study, which crossed at least 10 sabbatical programs across the country, was that some leaders, either intentionally or not intentionally, used the sabbatical to help strengthen the team back at home. And I know we'll be speaking a little bit about strengthening the organization as we go on, but that's another thing. And I don't think people should be shy feeling that they might be leaving, in 2 to 3 years about actually taking a sabbatical, because it's a great test run for the organization.
Yes, I fully agree with that. That's why having a coach or a consultant for the executive director who's departing can be very important to help that person stay centered and focused on how do they prepare the way for their own departure and moving forward in their lives, as well as leave the organization in a stable situation, because this is a time where everybody feels quite vulnerable.
One question is the next.
Deb, your audio is breaking up a little bit, and I didn't hear your question.
Less than what the market really range is for their position on how the organizations start to move and fully realize the appropriate salary range so they can attract a new ED.
Mm-hmm.
I just heard the last part of what Deb said. Karen, could you take that question?
Yeah, if you give us the next slide, I think it's one of the things that we need to consider about how the board and the executive can prepare the organization for a transition. And as I mentioned, that the departing executive may not have salary and benefits that would transition into a good retirement, or at least something that's a compensation for a job well done while they are searching for that next opportunity, and therefore trying to attract a new leader can really give sticker shock. So the things that we talked about, you know, building the organizational capacity, empowering your team, the sabbatical helps to do that. The vacation helps to do that. The question is, I think, for the executive is, what are your current practices in allowing people to step up into roles where you have already tested the bench strength in the different functional areas that you manage, including letting people run parts of your job? How are you spreading, if you would, the capacity of people to have those really strong relationships with key stakeholders so it's not personality driven, but organizationally embedded, that stakeholder has a variety of good relationships with a variety of people, board or staff, and executive director, that stays with the organization because there's a commitment for your mission, for your success. And the other piece is, do you have the money, right, to really move forward and to sustain the organization? So I know in one of the transitions that I helped to facilitate, the departing executive went on a really good fundraising strategy. I think it was more than $2 million were raised in order to keep that organization afoot and to have the reserves there so that person that was going to replace her did not have to go out and immediately start asking everybody for money. Well, that worked really well in some cases. However, it was still a challenge for that new executive to come in and build the relationship so that the former givers who had just given lots of money to that executive that was departing also felt comfortable in giving more money to the new executive. So you need to really have a good strategy on how are you going to diversify your funding, build a cushion, and move things forward. What would you like to add, Susan?
Well, sometimes those funders can help the organization feel confident in hiring an interim director. If the foundation has invested a lot in your organization to date, they have a big investment continuing to keep the organization strong. And so sometimes interim director money can come from funders that are already there. If there's an issue on your staff, if you know you needed to move someone along, now's the time to do that, so you don't leave that difficult work for your successor to do. If there are state contracts or federal contracts, making sure that those funders know about your transition and make a vote of confidence, really, in the organization by making a commitment to continue the funding during the transition. That's work that you can do. Make sure that the budget is ready for next year, that you don't leave a new person to do a budget right away, and make sure that the evaluations of your staff have been done on time and that there's a lot of information for the new executive director to use. So just shifting the focus from what is yet to be done to leave a healthy organization is really the work to be done during this time.
This is a question for both of you. Susan, I hope you can hear me now.
I can hear you now, Deb.
Yes, we can.
It came in from one of our listeners, and you can either take this at the end, but it may fit here. The listener asked, can transition successfully lead to conversations about mergers? And would this be the time that the board or the executive director, or together, they might be considering options other than going to a hire.
Absolutely. Sometimes mergers take a little bit longer, though. If your announcement is coming 9 months or 6 months before you're ready to leave, likely there isn't time to pursue a merger very fully. So the organization may start in that direction and then have an interim come in to lead the organization while that work is done. If you know of the possibility of a merger, or if you are thinking about whether the organization might do well to proceed down that path, before you announce, more like a year and a half or 2 years ahead of time would be a good time to pursue that. But saying during the merger that I will not stand for being the executive director in the new organization can make it easier for both organizations to do that work. It doesn't become a question of my executive director or your executive director being the surviving executive director then. They know that the organization's welfare is being put ahead of either of the executive directors in those positions. You might need 2 years rather than a few months to effectuate a merger.
You know, that's a great point, Susan, because for those who are, not getting ready for retirement, but they're looking for that next opportunity, that's strategic thinking ahead of time about who are your stakeholders and how might you build the organization's capacity. That strategic planning could let that merger question come up very early, not just when the person is ready to make the transition. So I know in the younger generations, many people are staying in jobs 3 to 5 years before they move on for that next opportunity to fulfill themselves. That's a great way to think about how you're going to build the organizational capacity without it competing with your personal goals and professional goals. All right. So I guess to summarize this segment, I guess the departure planning is really about the executive being clear enough to do both personal and professional planning, as well as doing a sustainability review of the organization. And this takes a lot of strength, I think, on behalf of the leader to be able to separate the personal identity from the organizational identity and get prepared to move forward with their own skills, experience, and hopes for the future, for whatever they might want to do. Sometimes people will procrastinate a lot in trying to get the plan done and kind of wing it, and that's a really great way to sabotage yourself and the organization. So our advice about getting, additional help for the organization and yourself, make sure as a departing executive you have your own coach. That should not be the person who is managing the organization's transition. You need someone who's going to be your advocate, and help you stay focused and let someone else manage the organization's transition. Anything that you would add to that, Susan or Deb?
Well,
Go ahead, Deb.
Before we move on, if either of you could talk to the importance of sometimes engaging in an organizational assessment at this point in time, and that is always a healthy thing to do. But if people have questions about all the great suggestions you just made, meaning they don't quite know, I've worked with organizations in a transition where the board is quite surprised by their financials, as an example. And I just worked on a study where 20% of incoming leaders inherited a turnaround. So an organizational assessment before that and before that hire might have told the organization where they stand. Do either of you have any comments on that before we move on?
I can imagine that would be a very difficult situation for a leader who's leaving, who understands that the organization isn't in great shape financially. This isn't a time in your career where you're hoping people will point out what you have not done well or things that are wrong with the organization under your leadership. So I think it is a very important piece for the organization to do, but it may be easier for the executive director to go ahead and step away and let that kind of work happen under an interim director. Just emotionally, I can imagine what a difficult thing that would be. Often organizations ask me whether they should do strategic planning at this moment. Is it better to have a strategic plan and then to do a search for a new executive director? Is it better to wait for a strategic plan and have a new executive director in place before you have that conversation? I really think it's a chicken and egg conversation. If you do have a strategic plan in place, at least do a strategic review so your hiring committee and your search consultant have that to go on. If you don't have a strategic plan in place and you have time, having an interim can allow that to happen. But if you're under time pressure, go ahead and wait. Bring in a new person and let them help you with the skills that they bring.
So, Susan, thank you. Sticking with you, once the leader has announced and the organization has done its planning around the transition or is, an assessment of what it's going to do, what's that space like for both the leaders and the organization living between what used to be their current leader and what is now their departing leader?
Go to slide 12.
It can be terribly awkward. It can be a warm and nurturing time as well. Having the wisdom to know which meetings to go to and which meetings not to go to, I think is the primary skill of the departing. And offering your assistance and your support without criticism is the place that you want to be. I yesterday afternoon had a conversation with a founding executive who had left 8 years ago, who was back for a community forum in the organization that was going through the second transition, and she still had criticism to offer. Being a senior statesperson at this point requires a lot of grace. But once you've decided to go, shift your role to supporter and friend and positive leader for the last few months that you're part of the organization.
Right.
Karen, do you have any perspective on this? A little bit of a Netherland for the organization.
It is, and each transition is going to be unique. However, as our next slide will show, as Susan mentioned, having a shift of focus and being able to shift your role is absolutely critical at this point. If you have been leading your organization for as many years as you've been with it, then continuing to go out as a leader that is demonstrating, the best possible ways of showing people how to move forward is going to be really important. So keeping your messaging clear is really helpful for yourself and for others, because people are going to be curious as to whether you're having second thoughts about whether you want to leave or not. Being able to encourage your board to really step up during the transition phase is going to be important. So if you have been a very successful executive and your board has trusted you all of this time and basically rubber stamped everything that you've ever requested of them, they may not feel quite comfortable yet in really thinking about how to leave you out of these critical discussions and then coming to consensus with how to move forward. So whatever you can do to facilitate that as you're moving forward, knowing that you're leaving a legacy, you're preparing the way, and you're moving forward into your own future with hopefully a bit of joy and hopeful expectation. And this isn't bound by, someone who has been around for many years and you're moving on to retirement. You could be at any stage in your career, and this would be important. So a really good departure would be kind of like a paradigm shift for you. All right. Susan has always recommended and has said it in different ways during this seminar that you need to resist doing things in the old ways because you're used to leading all of the meetings, having people attend certain meetings with or without you. How can you begin to step back and push others forward would be a really good way of thinking about preparing the way for the next leader and for the organization to have the skills, the confidence, and the abilities to close the gap of leadership once you leave. So taking care of yourself is going to be absolutely critical because the more that people see that you are taking a helpful and healthy approach to this transition, you're learning about yourself, you're learning more about others, you're moving into a new, hopefully, and desired future. Well, it's a great way for them to take greater confidence that they too can survive this change. A leadership transition is like any other change you have managed in the organization. It is fraught with denial, lots of emotion. There's finally going to be some acceptance, but hopefully people will move forward into those new futures with greater confidence and competence and never regret the foundation that you gave them as you help them to be the best that they could be under your leadership. All right.
I like to talk about the empty chair. Allow there to be an empty chair sometimes.
Great.
If there are 10 people at the table, say your board, and you go around a circle and each person says what they think might be the solution to an issue, if you are sitting in the 10th chair and you express your opinion, you change every other dynamic in the room. So if you leave that chair empty in some of these months during your transition and they go all the way around the table and you're not there to fill in the answer, this is the practice that they need to truly be the board for this organization for this time. But it's very difficult to let that chair stay empty while you're still in the building.
Oh, that's a great idea. And when you think about that, it's not that you're withholding information while you're letting the chair be empty, but you have given people information in advance for them to have great discussion, make good decisions in your absence. They don't have to look at you and feel as if they have to rely upon your presence in order to do some really great work. So being mindful, every step of this journey is really an important key to your success. All right. So what else would you have us talk about, Deb, before we start taking questions?
Well, I think if they would go through the next few slides, which you just talked through, Karen, why don't you end your comments with the final slide that just gives an overview of the transition process, and then I'll go to questions, which we have time for.
All right. Well, both Susan and I are advocates of a well-managed executive leadership transition. And this graphic is one of the things that helps you as departing executives to really think about how do you have the private musings, how clear is it about where you want to go with the organization and when you might want to step away, and the things that happen within the transition management process. So, if you are thinking 1 to 5 years out that you really want to make a transition at some point, then you have lots of opportunities. The further out you're thinking about this, you have lots of opportunities to start building the bench strength in your organization, making sure the appropriate training is happening for your staff so that every function is covered. You can start letting people shadow you in different meetings, start establishing relationship with funders. You can encourage your board to get more involved with the organization and really understand it programmatically and financially. You need to make sure that you have at least an emergency succession plan in place. So if there's an unexpected departure or for you or anybody else who has a very critical role, then you know who is prepared to step up. into that function so that the organization does not linger. I mean, that can even go down to the person who files all of the records and knows how to get access to information. If that person's ever missing, how in the world would everybody else in the organization access that critical information easily? So those are some of the basics around succession planning that can be done while you are still operating, long before you're ready to announce that you are prepared to leave. And then once you are prepared to make that announcement, then having, as we talked about earlier, a communication strategy and a transition of leadership strategy. And that organizational assessment is part of what needs to have happen in order to figure out what do you need to do to make sure that the organization is stable during this vulnerable time. If you prematurely announce to your funders that you are getting ready to leave, some funders may walk away or just wait to see who's coming in next before they provide additional funding. That's something you want to avoid. And then the pivot part of this is really where the board is stepping up more and more, along with the staff, to really identify the skills, knowledge, and abilities of the new leader that is capable of taking them into that desired future. So having a strategic plan, or at least a modified plan about where you want to go, is important to identify who's going to be that next leader. And then once that person has been selected, how do you support that person and the organization in thriving? So as you can see, this process is something that happens over time. And what we want to ensure is that there's a good departure for the current director, and that there's a good way to onboard the new leader as well, and have the board and the staff feel confident and competent of maintaining the organization's capacity in the process of this leadership change. Right.
Wonderful.
Prepared to be celebrated a little bit. A lot of times it's hard on the departing executive director to be the center of attention. But in order to have a good beginning, it is important to have that good ending and let people express their appreciation, and take the time for yourself to express your appreciation and love for the people that you've worked with as well.
Absolutely.
Well, and I want to thank you both for sharing your insights and the lessons you've culled from working with so many transitions and leaders across the country over many years. And we have about 10 minutes for some questions. And one that came through is one that I had already prepared because it's such an important one. And someone is asking, is it irresponsible to leave without grooming a realistic successor? And I wanted to add on the study I was working on that had over 900 respondents from across New England, about half say they believe that a successor should come from within, and about the other half of organizations believe a successor should come from externally. So this person leads us into that very interesting conversation that comes up often in the work of executive transition. So either of you want to start with that?
I'll hop in on that. A couple things come to mind. Although an executive director may very well like to have a person ready to step right in, it really is the board's responsibility to select a leader for the organization for the future. And if a year in advance you tell someone in the organization, you're my successor, I'm getting you ready, or maybe 15 years in advance you tell someone, you're my successor, I'm going to teach you what to do. When it comes time for the transition, there may be new board members. There may be people who have come into the organization who see a different vision and a separate future for the organization than that of the departing executive director. You can get in trouble and disappoint people and really derail someone's future and their career around promising succession. What I do advocate is building the field. If each of us builds our own staff so they are experienced and strong and ready for leadership, I may be preparing the leader for your organization, and you may be preparing the leader for mine. Or the board may decide, having had that conversation, that the internal candidate is the right one. But be careful as an executive director in stepping into the role that really belongs to the board.
I totally agree with you, Susan. It is important to prepare the field. And one of the biggest challenges, and it's often seen as a power play, is that you have an heir apparent. However, that heir apparent could be set up for immediate failure. There could be the unintended interim executive because the board and staff have witnessed what their strengths are and the day-to-day reactions to them and working together over time, as well as their vulnerabilities. And they may not be willing to follow that person in the same way that they were willing to follow you. So that person could be a qualified interim person until, there is a new leader found. That is expected. It's not uncommon. But whether you're going to build that internal leadership and grow within or attract someone from the outside, it really does depend upon where you're going, what are the skills, and are people willing to follow that internal person the way that they were willing to follow you. You may not be able to determine that. So that's why having those succession plans and building people's ability to step up into a variety of leadership positions helps to prepare the field as well as to create greater sustainability for your organization, whether there's a planned or unplanned transition that happens.
Okay. Now, someone else asked, and I apologize in advance because we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions. However, this person asked about whether you need an executive coach when you've been in your position for 30 years and you're an outgoing ED who is over 60, never had an executive coach before. So that's part of the question. I want to add to that, though. Could you end our question period by talking about the differences between someone earlier in their career, exiting the job possibly for a new job, versus someone who's leaving and they're actually going on to retirement? So the question from our participant is about, does that person really need an executive coach? Is that still a viable suggestion for them? But if you don't mind expanding upon that, just to do some comparison between earlier career and later career departures.
Let me jump in on the early career and later career. And Karen, you would have a lot to say, I think, on the coach question.
Okay.
For the earlier career leader, you may not have a lot of notice that you can offer to your organization if another position becomes available. If you're recruited, if you see an opportunity that you want to follow, in deciding to leave your organization, your notice might be a month or two, where we've been talking about transitions that happen over the course of a year, 9 months, 6 months. So having an organization that's healthy and ready to stand on its own during transition is the way to go for an early career executive director, to give you the freedom to give a month or 2 months notice and to move ahead. You have to have an organization ready to go through transition without you.
Point well taken. And that's also true if you've been in there for years. Be clear about where you are and be willing to admit, the things that are going well and what will need to be on the plate of the new leader. When it comes to having an executive coach, I think everybody needs one at some point because they can help you manage yourself and how you are in relationship with others and pursue your goals in a way that is successful. And it doesn't mean that you have this person for a year. It's not a therapist, but this is a person who's working with you on your behalf. They are your advocate and are drawing out questions based upon your wisdom about what it is that you would like to have happen next. So they help you form that strategy and give you a level of accountability with objectivity, all right, because they don't have a vested interest in this other than you being successful. So whether you're trying to figure out what is your next step in your life as a retiree, whether you are going on for career glory as someone who is early or in a mid-career stage, it is helpful. And maybe that coaching relationship is only going to be for maybe 3 months, 6 months, but to help you be stable, to be confident, and to move forward successfully, I think there's never a loss with that, having the help that you need.
Great. And then we actually have time for you to each take maybe a minute on this question, which I've seen and struggled with myself personally. When you have, you're planning to depart and or have announced, but a critical opening happens at the organization, for instance, your CFO or your development director, what's your advice on how to manage those kind of hirings while you're in transition?
Well, certainly it has to be done in consultation with your board. Although the executive director previously wouldn't feel that they would need to consult with the board before they hired a staff position necessarily, now that you're handing the organization into someone else's care, those decisions need to be made together. Here's where the interim comes in handy, not only an interim executive director, but potentially an interim CFO or director of development. Karen and I had spoken about the fact that in some parts of the country, it may be more difficult to find an interim. So having that succession plan in place might include interims in your community in a variety of positions so that in a pinch, when you're already on your way out the door, there are some interims you can call on.
Thanks.
Yep, I agree. Yeah, I agree. And if this is a planned transition rather than saying someone winning the lottery and not showing up the next day, all right, you need a transition plan for both jobs and let it be a part of the organization's consideration about how to move forward. So, you know, if anybody's looking for a new type of job and wants a new experience, becoming an interim leader is always a good opportunity. Short term, pays good, and your job is well focused. That's just a hint.
Wonderful. I want to respect people's time and thank everyone for participating, particularly Susan Egmont and Karen Gaskin-Jones. I want to thank our host, Nonprofit Quarterly, BoardSource, and Raffa PC. Remember, you will be getting a reading list after the seminar from one of our hosts with a lot of reference material on the subject matter. And this was part 2 of a 4-part series. On May 19th at 1:30, there will be the 3rd part of the series on executive transitions. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar.